So as you're aware, we're in the middle of a lecture series. It's going on for quite a while. I think there's really rich, interesting material here, and it has incredible contemporary significance. And so I'm doing it at leisure. There were important things that happened the last few days in politics. The Supreme Court upholding the Affordable Care Act yet again on a technicality, but a technicality that appears to insulate the Affordable Care Act from future challenges with regards to the individual mandate and whether that represents a tax. And so it does appear that the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare is here to stay. And increasingly, of course, tens of millions, maybe even hundreds of millions of Americans get their health care either directly or indirectly through the Medicaid expansion, through the subsidies, through the insurance marketplaces that piece of legislation set up. And so it's important to note that. By the way, happy Juneteenth. And it's worthwhile, in particular, celebrating this day now that it is a national holiday. And of course, Juneteenth marks the day in which the last slaves were formally freed in Texas 2.5 years after Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. It's been celebrated in African American communities from the 1870s to the present, and it is gaining national attention and prominence, especially now in light of the fact that it has been recognized as a new national holiday. And it's really the first time we are publicly commemorating the end of slavery in this way. We do have Martin Luther King Day, and that's a very important celebration of the struggle a century later for civil rights to finally try to bring home on the ground the liberties that were won but not in fact realized after the Civil War. But now another important commemoration. And maybe at some point we all even speak together about the battle to influence public memory and the extremely important role that plays in shaping the way in which we deal with the legacies of racial injustice and the challenges that we face in light of those legacies in the 21st century. And I'll be speaking actually more concretely about some of those legacies in the second half of the lecture today. The lecture today is going to continue to focus on the history of American political parties. We spoke a lot last week about the Republican Party and about the important transformative legislation policies that the Republicans passed and used in Lincoln's first term in office while conducting a civil war, at the same time building national railroads, redistributing land in the West, creating land grant colleges, creating a national currency, creating national bonds to fund the federal treasury, a federal income tax that was progressive really for the first time in history. So much that was done in that extremely pivotal 4 years in which Lincoln and the Republicans had pretty much complete dominance over national politics. So today, I'll end that story by talking about what happened to the Republicans in the aftermath of the Civil War, and also try to draw some of the lessons of the transformation of the Republican Party after Lincoln, as well as begin looking at the Democrats, and with a bit of luck, draw some history lessons for us from the role that the Democratic Party played in the last quarter of the 19th century through the middle of the 20th century. That's where we're going. I'm going to refresh your memory that one of the framing insights, I think, to have in mind when we're looking at this history of partisanship is that, in a sense, the United States has gone through two long periods of one-party dominance since the Civil War. Republican dominance from the 1860s through the 1920s, Democrat dominance from the early 1930s through the late 1970s, and then a third period of partisan parity. And that much of what we see in terms of hyperpartisanship and the paralysis that it produces is not applicable to periods of one-party dominance, but seems to be rooted in the structural incentives that partisan parity gives to politicians and parties to try to win the majority in the next election by preventing the current majority party from accomplishing much in the current session of Congress, right? And so that's building on Francis Lee's important study, Insecure Majorities. We left off talking about Heather Cox Richardson and her important works to make men free and how the South won the Civil War. And I'm now going to pick up with, in a sense, the second half of Cox Richardson's narrative, which concerns the period after the Civil War, after Lincoln's assassination and the transformation of the Republican Party. I won't review all of this, but to just bear in mind that I treated the Republican Party under Lincoln and from the middle of the 1850s to the middle of the 1860s as an exemplary common good political party. And part of the reason that I view them in this way, and I'll refresh your memory on this in a moment, is because of their view of a democratic political economy, a political economy that would allow equality of opportunity, sufficient equality that each citizen could be genuinely equal, and a non-competitive economy, an economy in which what is good for the individual is also good for the society, so we don't have to line up in factions and fight it out over who gets the biggest piece of the pie. There's enough pie to go around for everyone, and each person taking their fair share actually enlarges the pie for everyone. Remember also, as I've just listed, all of the accomplishments of the Republican Party when they were in power for that first 4 years, and then Lincoln's effort to indicate the transformed public philosophy that these legislative accomplishments enabled in his address at Gettysburg, in which he makes equality a co-equal value to freedom in his conception of the creed of the United States. So with all of that in mind, now what happens after the Civil War? And of course, Lincoln is assassinated right as the Civil War draws to a close. And as a result, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, becomes president. And I think it's worthwhile noticing that Andrew Johnson is vice president, despite being a Democrat, despite being a Southerner, because Lincoln views it as both, in a sense, what certain factions in his party want, which was the result of bizarre internal Republican politics, but much more importantly, because it was a way of assuaging, of catering to the interests of New York businessmen, bankers, and industrialists. And here, right, Andrew Johnson, there's a bitter split between him and the Republican Congress, which results in his impeachment, his near conviction, really as close as an American president has come to being convicted. He gets acquitted by one vote short of that two-thirds majority in the Senate required to convict. And there's this ongoing tug of war around Reconstruction in the South, and around, in particular, whether or not after the Civil War African Americans will get genuine equal rights in the South. Now, the other part of the story, so right, Johnson, in many respects, obstructs the effort of congressional Republicans to use the victory in the Civil War to remake the South, and to undo the racial hierarchy, or at least to radically diminish its character. And as you know, one of the influential works on the Jim Crow period that I particularly like, that won a Pulitzer Prize, is called Slavery by Another Name. And the account there suggests that eventually the South resumed something like the hierarchical structure. That's a book by Douglas Blackman, by the way, that it had prior to the Civil War. And that's, I think, in part attributable to Andrew Johnson, as well as the Compromise of 1877, which we'll talk about in a moment. But the other big development here, and I think, again, this is really important, and we're going to draw out some of the implications a little later in the lecture, is that during the Civil War, the United States economy is deeply transformed. It's transformed by the war effort itself. And let's remember, this is in many respects one of the first modern wars in terms of the way in which military technology reflects the industrial production of munitions. And the war effort leads, especially in the North, to the beginning of the development of an industrial economy. And one of the ironies of the Civil War is that a war fought in the name of equality, of eliminating slavery and slave power, is that it results in a new industrial oligarchy gaining extreme concentrated wealth. What another Republican a generation later, Teddy Roosevelt, will call robber barons, right? And so they have their roots in the Civil War, and already by the late 1860s, they're making their concentrated wealth politically relevant. They're turning it into political power. So by the time we get Johnson out of office and we have Grant in office, the policy to the South changes in the direction of radical republicanism, but the policy for the nation increasingly becomes a pro-business policy. And this particularly takes hold in the late 1870s. Through the 1890s, the period of Republican dominance, and so one of the questions here is, how does the Republican Party become the party of business? And one of the really important transformations that occurs is after the transformation of 1877, the withdrawal of Northern troops from the South, the reassertion of white hierarchical power in the South, the institutionalization of disenfranchisement, things we'll be talking about a little bit later. The question of what to do about the South gets recast as being primarily one about labor and less as one about race. And the Republican Party comes to be an anti-socialist and in many ways an anti-worker party in this period. And so the idea that legitimates and rationalizes the Compromise of 1877 and the withdrawal of Northern troops in the South is that what the Southerners are asking the North to do, those who want Northern military presence and Northern political power to continue to assist in restructuring the social order of the South, they're asking them to benefit labor, right? Not to counteract racial hierarchy. And that's because those Southern laborers, the poor ones who want the Northern help, are lazy or cowardly or lack the ethic and the spirit that would allow them, if they were only sufficiently dedicated and enterprising, to work their way out of their poverty, right? And in many ways, this is an explicit repudiation of the economic philosophy of Lincoln and Greeley and the early Republicans, that when you have concentrated wealth and oligarchy, it's not possible to work your way out of poverty. And that's why slavery can't be extended to the West. Now, the alternative suggestion coming from the Republican Party in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s is, look, if you're poor, go west. You've got that escape valve. And that's increasingly less true in the later part of the 19th century. And it's certainly not an adequate answer to the racial hierarchy of the South. As you know, there were laws in place that actually criminalized African Americans migrating away from the South. And so this then is a very important change in Republican ideology or philosophy that is part and parcel of the Republican Party becoming the party of business. And this happens because the Republican Party cannot win national power without winning New York, right? The South has become solidly Democrat, and the New York vote is the single largest vote in the Union at this point. It is the key to winning the Electoral College. And the key to winning New York is having the business lobby on your side, both in terms of the funding that it will provide and terms also of the degree to which the Republican Party at the state level in New York is controlled by businessmen who demand that the Republican Party adopt a pro-business, anti-labor ideology that extends to the South. And so this then is on Cox Richardson's account, and this is there in her earlier book to make men free, and particularly present in her most recent book, How the South Won the Civil War, the idea of the cowboy myth, right? That there is a American spirit that lives out west, in which wild, free men make their fortune herding cattle, cultivating land, panning for gold. And if you're a poor laborer in the Northeast, if you're a poor farmer in the Midwest, it's your fault. You're poor because you're not taking advantage. You're not brave, wild, enterprising, lucky enough. And so there's no role for government here. This is something government has already secured. It built the railroads. It gave the land grants. You should take advantage of the opportunity that exists out west. The other big development in the last third of the 19th century is the growth of machine politics, right? And so we're now getting political parties in something like the form we know them in the 21st century, or at least the framework, the infrastructure of the political party, which is to say there are professional organizers, there are funding networks, the press becomes extremely important, and the press essentially is a very partisan press in the last third of the 19th century in the US. So you know which papers are Republican papers, which papers are Democratic papers, and you know, actually some of the papers call themselves the Republic or the Democrat, right? You need funding, you need organization, you need professional staffers, both to run campaigns in an increasingly urban country where getting out the vote, especially the vote of new wave upon wave of immigrants from Europe, is extremely important. And you need the financing both to run those intricate operations that the parties now organize and to get the newspapers out to make the case for your side. And again, the result is that the newly emerging industrial oligarchy gets much more political influence, especially in the Republican Party. The Democratic Party, on the one hand, is a party of the South, on the other hand, is the party of labor and immigrants. And this is then the emerging divide, the Democratic Party getting its funding primarily from laborers and eventually from emerging labor unions, the Republican Party getting its funding from industrial oligarchs. It's worthwhile noting that in the 1880s, Grover Cleveland and the Democrats gained power temporarily. Cleveland, by the way, we'll talk a little bit more about him, is a two-term president, the only president in the history of the United States who serves two non-consecutive terms, right? And when he's in office in the early 1880s, you get the first really anti-immigrant legislation, the Chinese Restriction Act of 1882, and you get now clearly the reemergence of what I'm going to call pluralism and a competitive view of the American political economy, and group pluralism, right? And this is a term that's introduced in 20th century American political science, but I would suggest it's really being used to describe something that's emerging in the last quarter of the 19th century, is a view that the political parties and the major interest groups in a democratic polity are not about the common good. They are there to represent the narrow group interests of their members. And maybe when they actually gain political power, they'll have to compromise with the other side. And what will emerge is something in which each side gets some of their interests satisfied. But the main purpose of a political party is a lot like that of the labor union, not to pursue the common good, but to pursue the interests of their members. And this then informs both the Republicans and the Democrats in the 1880s. It's part of the reason you get anti-immigrant legislation at this point, is because there's this increasingly competitive view of the economy in which keeping people out is going to be good for the domestic indigenous worker, right? And of course, there's anti-Chinese racism that goes into this as well, that makes it such that you restrict Chinese immigration, not European immigration in the 1880s, that will eventually catch up. The other thing that the Democrats do when they gain power, and I think it's quite interesting, this is in a sense a continuation of the early Lincolnian Republican ideology, which is you get the Pendleton Act in 1883, which is the start of a nonpartisan system for filling the civil service jobs, right? And the idea there is to move away from the spoils system, in part because the Democrats recognized that that was how the Republicans were maintaining power in urban America, despite the fact that the Republicans clearly were in the pocket of the oligarchs, and there was no reason other than their capacity to dole out positions and goods that they should be winning elections. In the late 1880s, the Republicans regained control of both Congress and the presidency. And in particular, Benjamin Harrison is the president. Andrew Carnegie is high up in his administration, working for what becomes the Federal Reserve, etc. And Carnegie is very explicit in reviving what was, if you remember, the view that Lincoln and Greeley acted against, which is James Hammond's oligarchic view of politics, his famous mudsill speech, right? You can only build society on the basis of those you oppress. And what's interesting about Carnegie's, and there's several explicit speeches and editorials that he writes in the early days of the Harrison administration about Carnegie's philosophy, is that he substitutes work ethic for race. And in this way, perhaps makes it a little bit more palatable, a little bit less obviously racist to suggest that society is naturally hierarchical, that those who don't do well, not because social structures keep them down. The wealthy purchase political influence and then use it to prevent their wealth from being redistributed and others from competing with them, that they create monopolies, all of this stuff which was obviously going on at this period. But instead, because the workers are lazy, disorganized, would rather take the wealth of the rich than generate their own wealth, and that if they are allowed to do that, it will undermine the wealth of the entire society, right? It's not just redistribution, it is going to make it such that wealthy people will no longer want to live and create wealth in the United States. Again, going all the way back now, if you remember, to the work of Daniel Zablat and his critical account of the emergence of conservative parties, this idea that if you can reframe the debate being less about the redistribution of wealth and more about something else, what Carnegie and Harrison are doing is suggesting that socialism, and this is when this term starts being used as a insult in American politics, right? That socialism is a European export, un-American, and that the workers who are supporting the Democratic Party are socialists, are recent immigrants, are trying to import European politics to the United States. We've got the West, we've got the cowboy, we've got opportunity. This should be rejected. And ultimately, this line, although it becomes the dominant party line of the Republican Party, does not succeed in keeping Harrison and Carnegie in office. And Grover Cleveland wins a second term in 1893. And here I think there's an extremely important story to be told, and that's about the way in which Harrison and the Republicans in Congress in the period between the time Cleveland wins election and the time he actually takes office, do everything they can to torpedo the American economy. Most importantly, this includes spending down all of the money in the Federal Reserve so that when Cleveland enters office, there is literally nothing in the cupboards for him to do anything with. And in addition to that, to saying again and again to Europeans, don't invest in America. This is going to be an economic disaster. And this is a period in which the American economy is reliant upon European investment, and the Europeans listen to Harrison and withdraw their investment. And the result is that Grover Cleveland inherits a disastrous economic depression without the resources to do anything about it, right? And so this, to my mind, represents the complete reversal of Lincoln's vision, the idea that as opposed to there being a common good political economy, you would, for the sake of partisan advantage, ruin the economy and then leave it for your successor to pick up the pieces. I think you're beginning to hear in this account of the late 19th century themes that you may view as quite relevant to the 21st century. So let me conclude my discussion now of this transformation of the Republican Party by noting that this is not completely cast in stone, the Republican Party becoming the party of business. That as opposed to that, what we get with the Republican Party, and I'm trying to see, did I skip a slide? No, I guess this is where I want to be, is repeated oscillations. And we see this in the early 20th century, in which, in fact, the first and most successful campaign to oppose the oligarchs of industry is that waged by Teddy Roosevelt from within the Republican Party. And of course, Roosevelt famously calls himself a trust buster, right? That he's going to break up the monopolies. And that is, in fact, what he does in his 2 terms in office in the early 20th century. And that reflects, I'm sorry, I'm kind of skipping around a little bit here, but this is the 4th point, the instability of a clearly, avowedly pro-business, anti-labor party in a democratic system in which, early 19th century, all men, at least all white men, have the vote, right? Because the majority of people are going to be workers, or in this case, workers and farmers. And so unless you convince them to ignore their economic interests and to focus on something like the question of the un-American import of socialism to the United States, there's going to be a natural structural advantage for the party that sides with the workers, the farmers, the ordinary people. And so Teddy Roosevelt in particular, right, with Lincoln in mind, because he's running for office only 40 years after Lincoln ran for office, tries to resurrect the egalitarian, cooperative, inclusive, anti-oligarchic ideology of the Republican Party, and in fact does so quite successfully. And then, of course, the Republican Party reverts, especially under Herbert Hoover, to being a very strongly pro-business party. And then on Cox Richardson's telling, the final oscillation that occurs one more time is the oscillation that occurs between Hoover Eisenhower and then Nixon, right? Where Eisenhower is yet another egalitarian Republican, or at least a much more liberal and progressive Republican than Hoover had been or than Nixon would be. And so the Republican Party is pulled in two directions at once. On the one hand, by its principles and by the dynamics of trying to win elections. And on the other hand, by its financing, by the fact that its operations are financed by business people with concentrated wealth who want to keep that wealth and see the Republican Party as the instrument for passing policies that favor their wealth. And so now to conclude this discussion of the Republican Party, I want to recap the early Republican democratic theory of the political economy, and noting three aspects to it, which I hope will be, in a sense, generally relevant. First, that the government must actively promote an economy of equal opportunity, and do so not only or primarily for reasons of social justice. It's good for everyone to have opportunity, but primarily for reasons of what you might call democratic justice, that you need for there to be political equality among your citizens, for there also to be equal economic opportunity. Right? That in a society in which each person can generate a sufficient share of wealth to become a self-assured, fully participating citizen, you will have genuine democracy and political equality. In a society in which you don't, then you're going to have oligarchy. And then the second prong of this economic philosophy, the government must actively promote a cooperative political economy, a political economy in which what benefits the workers or the farmers also benefits the industrialists or the landowners, and that there are things you can do with the distribution of opportunity, with the creation of infrastructure, with the distribution of land and education, with interest rates and the supply of money that promote a cooperative economy, a less competitive economy, and for everyone to be able to get along and to be able to work on compromise, on working together politically. You need an economy that supports that. Third idea, and I think this is the most critical idea, is the government must actively counteract the oligarchic tendencies of a modern market economy. That is to say, the tendencies of a capitalist economy to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of the few, that is natural, structural, inescapable. It's a tendency that you have to, if you're going to promote democracy, create policy to counteract. That could be tax policy, that could be infrastructure policy, educational opportunity policy, land policy, etc. And please note that the Republicans used a combination of progressive income tax and tax on manufactured goods in order to promote a cooperative economy in addition to promoting equality of opportunity. Now, I think one of the critical questions that emerges from this history is, okay, Lincoln succeeded in actually implementing policies that realized the Republican view of a democratic political economy. Was that only possible in agrarian economy? Remember, what Lincoln is actually doing is giving land in the West to people who see themselves stymied by hierarchy and stratification in the East. So is it only possible when essentially what you're doing is allowing people to work land with their own labor? And that's not going to work. by the time you get to the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, certainly not going to work in the 21st century? Or is it possible to re-articulate this vision of an economy that creates genuine equality of opportunity and sufficient equality of outcomes so that everyone is an equal citizen, that promotes a more cooperative economy, a less oligarchic economy, because it counteracts the tendencies to concentrate in income and wealth? Is it possible to do that in an industrial economy where what you're focusing on now is labor relations, right? And that's part of the reason that when the more egalitarian, progressive political commitment shifted from the Republican to the Democratic Party, it was possible to tar the Democrats with the brush of socialism, right? They're supporting unionization, organized labor, redistribution. That's very different from just giving land to individuals so that they can create their own opportunity. Now you're asking government to put its heavy hand on the scales of economic distribution. And though I don't agree with that critique, I think you can understand why that critique is more powerful than the critique of the early Republican effort to just give land to people and to let them use their own labor to turn that land into a productive resource. So how do we, if we're interested in it, revive the Republican theory of political economy for the 20th or the 21st century, for an industrial or a post-industrial economy? That seems to me one of the big urgent questions that emerges from considering this history. Another thing we should note is that there's a fairly clear-cut political realignment that emerges in the late 19th century and in many respects is still with us in the third decade of the 21st century, in which the Democrats are seen as the workers' party. And if we're talking about the late 19th, early 20th century, we've got to add the white workers' party, because of course the Democrats include the Dixiecrats, who are a party of white supremacists and who refuse to allow any national legislation to proceed that might benefit African American workers, right? And so at least through the first half of the 20th century, the Democrats are a workers' party, but a white workers' party. And the Republicans are primarily seen as, and in fact, act as, the party of big business, and argue that that is the more American approach to political economy. In order to do this, in order to win elections as a party of big business, the Republicans need to recast politics so that elections are not primarily about equality or distribution. And instead, they make it about race or immigration, patriotism and war, and especially about the ethical standing of the workers. Are they self-sufficient or are they lazy, right? And here again, I think Cox Richardson helps us to see the extreme importance of the cowboy myth. And here I think it's not an accident that we end up electing a president who, as an actor, portrayed cowboys and who continues to project this image of Western rugged individualism. Of course, I'm talking about Ronald Reagan. So two lessons I want to draw from this history. The first is the law of unintended consequences. And many of you will be aware of this from other contexts, but this is the idea that in politics, you very often act for one end or aim and end up producing a very different aim, even though your intentions were the best, you did your level best to pass policy to achieve them, you don't see the way in which that policy is going to play out or all of its implications. And so the Republicans in the 1860s pass a whole raft of extremely creative, transformative legislation to promote their vision of political equality, equal opportunity, a cooperative economy, democratic equality, and end up, among other things, producing an oligarchy of industry, right? Lo and behold, the railroads and the war effort, the new banks, the new bonds, the new currency, allow industrialization to take off and a new and pernicious form of concentrated wealth to take hold. How do you not only accomplish your initial legislative agenda, but then seek to continue to steer and guide the effects, including the unanticipated effects of that legislation? Right. And so this is sometimes called the beware what you wish for principle of politics. Oftentimes, when you get what you want, it doesn't do what you thought it was going to do. A second issue here that comes out of this story is the tendency to elite capture in political parties. And here we deal with the fact that political parties need resources. This is especially true of late modern political parties in which media are so important, in which expertise in terms of organizing and targeting voters, polling, etc. All of this stuff comes at a high cost. Who has the resources to actually fund it? Well, people with a lot of wealth. And so parties tend to be captured by the wealthy, and this is especially true when two conditions apply. The first is that the parties themselves are not publicly supported financially. Yes. And as I've noted to you before, the majority of democratic societies finance not only individual candidates when they're conducting a campaign, but also finance their major political parties in non-campaign periods, right? And in the United States, we have never done this, and the result is that political parties need to depend for the resources that they require to operate on whoever can furnish those resources. And oftentimes, that is the wealthy. The other condition that matters a great deal is how narrowly or broadly distributed wealth is. And if you have concentrated wealth, then the hyper wealthy will normally have disproportionate and excessive influence on politics and will therefore be well positioned to capture political parties. That doesn't mean that that's stable, right? And in many respects, I think what we saw in 2016 was a reaction against the idea that the political parties had been bought and sold by the hyper wealthy. Unfortunately, unlike Teddy Roosevelt, it did not take a constructive, redistributive, progressive path. That resentment, that grievance played out in terms of populism instead of progressivism. But that's a liability built into the kind of party system we have in the United States, in which the parties are not publicly financed, and it's especially susceptible in a period of extreme inequality or concentrated wealth, like the period we have today in the United States. All right, so I threw a lot at you there. We're on our way to the 21st century, coming out of the 19th and 20th century, and Flossie has her hand up already. Please, yes. Go ahead.
Well, I want to thank you clearing up and cleaning up any illusions that I had about Harrison. I always thought he was nothing because my literature tells me higgledy-piggledy Benjamin Harrison, 23rd president, was, and as such, served between Clevelands. And save for this trivial idiosyncrasy, didn't do much. Well, he did a lot of harm. He really did. And that takes me back to one of our presidents who was assassinated, Garfield, who might have been a very good president. Any thoughts about that?
I'm afraid you're going to expose some of my ignorance of American politics, which is
okay.
I don't have a lot to say about Garfield. I think it's worthwhile noting that he's assassinated in part because he resists giving offices to his backers, right? And so, right, you know, he doesn't play the spoils game well enough, and somebody who's pissed off about that ends up putting a bullet in him. No, I don't know enough about Garfield to know whether he would have been a better president or not. And I think, of course, we have to be careful of paying too much attention to the personality of the individual and not enough attention to the structural conditions, right? And so, yeah, Harrison is certainly not going to make anybody's list of great presidents of the United States. But is that in part because he needed Carnegie to fund him and to keep funding him, and therefore had to do his bidding? And maybe that's not entirely his limitations so much as the nature of the political economy of the late 19th century.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
Thank you for the good question, and I'll try to do a little bit more research on Garfield and see if I can give you a better answer next time. Anybody else want to play 19th century political trivia or ask about other aspects of the kind of 21st century implications of some of this analysis? I'm trying to draw that out for you. Were you already familiar with the law of unintended consequences? Does it give you pause, right? I mean, part of the issue here is that politics is so complicated because, of course, you're not working with physical objects governed by physical laws. You're working with human beings who are governed by their individual psychology, their subjective understandings, as well as their complicated interactions. And so you do one thing thinking it's going to have this consequence, and lo and behold, by the time it plays out, cascades through hundreds of millions of people's intentions and interactions, it ends up having a very different consequence than what you anticipated. I don't think that's a reason not to act politically, but it is a reason to be, on the one hand, informed by some humility, right? It's not always going to go the way you think or hope it's going to go. And on the other hand, and I think this is extremely important, getting a lot of information and not thinking that we passed our legislation, we won, right? But as opposed to that, thinking passing the legislation is just the first stage. And we've always got to monitor to see, is the legislation doing what we thought it would do? And if it isn't, what do we need to change to accomplish those goals better? And this is part of the problem with partisan paralysis, is it's practically impossible to revise legislation once it's passed with the razor-thin majorities and the zero-sum politics of partisan destruction that seem to be par for the course over the last couple decades.
Yep.
Bob, you're going to double down on the idea that I don't make people smile? Right. That's yes. It's but I do think, as we come to better understand how the partisan alignment we have right now emerged, we may have some historical background, some knowledge, some guiding principles to figure out what we could do in the 21st century to maybe break out of this impasse that we're in right now. If there aren't any other questions, I will let you go. And I will just also tell you that beginning next week, I'm going to shift focus to the Democrat Party, to the Democrats, and looking at their role, and then really bring things into the 21st century. We got a few more lectures left in this series, and I do want to really start focusing on what's happened since 1980, since the period of partisan parity, and in particular, what gave us Trump and what we can anticipate going forward, given the degree of hyper partisanship, negative partisanship that's characteristic of contemporary American politics. All right, everybody.
Do we want to hear that?
Pardon?
Do we want to hear that?
Well, you can always hit mute or go do something else. But I do think part of the goal of these lectures, of course, is to not just wallow in what's gone wrong, but to learn from it to try to figure out how to do better. And so as much as we might not want to hear it, we may need to hear it in order to strategize as well as to understand. Thanks, Suzanne. And thank you, everybody. Great being with you. Have great weeks, and happy Father's Day to the fathers.
Yes, happy Father's Day, yes.
Happy Juneteenth to everyone. Take care. See you next week. Bye, guys.
See you. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.